play, or I guess it was a novella or whatever, A Christmas Carol by Dickens. That's interesting and has stuck around for so long because in the beginning, Scrooge is not wise, right? He's extremely focused, almost absurdly focused on money. He thinks that money is the most important thing. And through a series of like wisdom inducing experiences, he starts to realize that he had it wrong and wants to change. And in the end, everybody gets that, holiday feeling of cheer and goodwill and love and what have you, because, he goes and he buys the family a turkey and sits Tiny Tim on his lap or whatever. And you just kind of get this wonderful feeling like now he's on the right track, right?
So let me ask you about that, Jay, because I think that's interesting. I think about this sometimes. Obviously, neither of us know Socrates, so we can't speak for him. But I often wonder, and that's a good example of it, if Socrates were around now or during that, in the spirit of how he thought and perhaps how he thought about philosophy, do you think he would have watched A Christmas Carol, for example, and said, and maybe taken issue with the fact, or at least question, that it seems to be a pretty clear, conclusive message, that approach to life, which is more around greed, which I think most people would agree, right? That's a general consensus. There is problems with that. But do you think he would question the way in which it's being taught of like, that's clearly wrong, this is clearly better? Because that whole idea of I don't really know anything, and who are any of us to really say? So just an example, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be that specific one, but that idea of concrete truths or concrete points that like, yeah, we should be teaching people this and making somewhat of an objective statement to say this is better than that. Do you think the pure philosophers of the world, the Socrates, would be okay with that? Or do you think they'd question it and say, yeah, that might be right, but we can't go too far. We still have to even question that idea being right.
I like that question. In fact, wisdom is always, in my opinion, trying to synthesize extremes. It would be almost impossible to say that wisdom always lies on this far end of things, because you can imagine, and that's why the Dickens novella was so interesting, because you can stretch it if you just phrase it correctly and think about it right. So one might say that compassion is better than selfishness, or whatever the opposite of compassion is. But you can also kind of come up with a scenario where you would sort of be like, aha, right? So compassion is not perfect, right? Or, like Lord of the Flies or whatever, things. You can write some very interesting stories along the lines of, okay, so let me think about how I can support what I just said. If one were to say that independence, how about being part of a group, being part of a team is extremely important, good, and always wise. You could point to Lord of the Flies and say, well, they were a team, but they got completely off track and turned into, a nightmare team or whatever. So you can't say a team is, is better than individuality, for example. And so I think philosophy and wisdom always tries to look at the entire panorama and say, well, if you have individuality versus collectivism, or unity or whatever, unanimity, what's better? And the answer is always kind of requires footnotes like, well, neither one's better. Depends on the context. Maybe in some contexts, a little bit of this is better than a little bit of that. But if you change the context, then that doesn't hold true anymore. And so that's one of the
that's
things
the challenge, right? That's the
thing.
challenge of wisdom, is that all those footnotes, all those caveats, all those hedges, because so many of us, or so many people, we want simple answers, and we think wisdom should be simple. Like, just tell me the answer and then I'll go do it. And when you tell people like, well, actually, and I know this is very much in the vein of your book, because I've heard you talk about it, where like, I think you said, somebody quoted as saying like, it's a self-help book that people that like self-help books won't like, or something like that. And I think that idea of like, it's not clean, like it's super messy. People are uncomfortable with that. They don't want to have to, if you can't guarantee me there's going to be a clear answer, and you're telling me there's all these footnotes and all this different back and forth, like, too exhausting. I'm just going to put my head down and go the way I go. And although I totally get that approach, and in some ways I envy it, I think much like you, there's just too much out there to say like, but you can't. You have to swim in that uncertainty and that, messiness, because it's net positive for life.